Madam President, I want to take the floor today because I am very disturbed by the apparent shift in attitude by many elected leaders, including some in this body and in the House. The attitude towards people who do the work that I call, that make the country run, that makes this country run. You know, they don't sit behind desks. They don't wear coats and ties every day or wonderful clothes. They don't sit in air-conditioned offices. They don't clip coupons. They just do hard work. It's the people you run into every day when you go in a local coffee shop and you order your latte, or you maybe go out to lunch and you have lunch at a restaurant, or you hail a taxi. Maybe you get on a bus or the subway. Oh, maybe now, since it's near Christmas time, you go to the department store, you're doing your Christmas shopping, and it's that person standing behind the counter. Now, you think that person is only there for you when you go in there to buy your Christmas present, but you think about her. She's probably been standing there all day long. And after you get out of there, she's still standing there to wait on somebody else. That's what I'm talking about. People that just, you know, they're not the big wheels in our society. They never ever thought of themselves as being big wheels, but they are the cogs and the inner workings that make our country run. Well, there used to be fairly universal agreement that these people are the backbone of this country, the foundation of our economy, that our job as elected officials is to do all we can to ensure that all of these working Americans have a decent shot at the American dream. We used to agree that if you worked hard and played by the rules, you should be able to earn enough to support your family, keep a roof over your head, put some money away for a rainy day, have a secure retirement. We used to agree that if you lose your job through no fault of your own, especially at a time of chronically high unemployment, you should have some support to get you through the rough patch while you're looking for new work. We used to agree, not too long ago, on both sides of the aisle, that no child in this country should go to bed hungry at night. I say both sides. I remember McGovern and Dole and McGovern. And the great work they did on hunger in America. But in recent years, it's been alarming to see how these fundamental principles and values are being attacked in our public discourse. For many, the new attitude is you're on your own. And if you struggle, even if you face insurmountable challenges, well, it's probably your own fault. Madam President, it just seems to me that there's a harshness abroad in our land, a harshness that I think of as sort of born of a benign neglect. It's a harshness born of a benign neglect toward those Americans who just have tough lives, maybe ill-educated, marginally employed, or they're just down on their luck. It used to be we only heard harsh rhetoric like that from radio talk show partisans who were trying to get their ratings up. Sadly, now it's become a part of our everyday conversation here, even in the United States Congress. We hear how minimum wage workers don't deserve a fair minimum wage increase because, well, they're just not worth $10.10 an hour. We hear that unemployed workers should be cut off from unemployment insurance because they're becoming, quote, dependent. At a time when there are 3 job seekers for every job, we hear it's critical to take away food assistance from millions of individuals so that supposedly, if you take away their food, if you take away their unemployment insurance, well, they'll now somehow learn the redemptive power of work. As if young mothers working service jobs, laid off factory workers delivering newspapers, unemployed families receiving SNAP benefits, that somehow they need to be lectured by members of the Congress about work. These people know what it's like to work. What happened to our respect for the people who do the work and want to work in our country? What happened to our values? The basic moral truth that people shouldn't go hungry in the richest country in the world. Whence comes this harshness of ours? Reminiscent, really, of the late 19th century workplace in America. How do we get to the point where many of us value the work of day traders pushing paper on Wall Street, but we ignore the contributions of the people who work in our daycare centers, educate our kids, care for our elderly in the twilight of their lives? What about their value? I wish the people who are pushing this harsh rhetoric could talk to Terrence, a father of 3 in Kansas City, Missouri. He works 50 hours a week. Now, don't lecture him about working. 50 hours a week, 2 jobs, one at Pizza Hut, one at Burger King, to try to make ends meet. He can barely insure his 15-year-old car or purchase shoes for his 3 girls. Last year, he lost his house. He told the Washington Times, quote, "We work hard for companies that are making millions. We're not asking for the world. We want to make enough to make a decent living. We deserve better. If they respect us and pay us and treat us right, it'll lift up the whole economy." End quote. Now, I'll bet you Terrence never got a degree in economics. But he says it better and understands it better than a lot of these economic thinkers down at the federal, down our big banks and these economic think tanks. Well, they should speak with Edward, a father in Illinois. Both he and his fiancée earn the minimum wage. Here's what he says, quote, "We have 3 children. Our paychecks combined barely cover the necessities like a roof over our heads, gas and lights, clothes for the kids. We wouldn't be able to make it without government assistance like food stamps and a medical card. There's constant stress because we're living paycheck to paycheck and never have enough money. Everyone needs help sometimes, especially since the economy is so bad, and it's made life even harder for working people. This isn't about needing more money for luxury things. We need a raise in the living wage in order to survive." End quote. So, Madam President, Edward and Terrence clearly are not lazy. They're doing exactly what we might expect them to do, what we've told them they must do to make it in this country. But they're slipping further and further and further behind through no fault of their own. The fact is, our economy has changed. It's not working. For many families right now, we can't stick our heads in the sand and pretend that it's not true. And we shouldn't suggest that it's Edward and Terrence's fault or that their kids don't deserve to eat or to wear shoes. We as elected officials have an obligation to recognize the fundamental truths about the challenges that working families face in America. We have a duty to support policies that will help these families both weather the continuing economic storm and also build a brighter future for their children. Now, first, we have to acknowledge the truth that while we are slowly moving in the right direction, the economy has not recovered, especially for those at the bottom of the economic ladder, the Edwards and Terrences and others. Jobs are still scarce. 4 million people have been pounding the pavement for at least 6 months looking for new work. There are 3 job seekers for every job. Our economy is still millions of jobs short of what we need. In the past, when the job market was this challenging, politicians on both sides of the aisle agreed that the federal government had an obligation to step in and help the long-term unemployed while they're struggling to find work. In fact, the current federal unemployment insurance program was put in place in 2008 under a Republican president, George W. Bush. And we did it when the unemployment rate was 5.6%. Today, the unemployment rate officially is 7%. We know it's higher than that. That's the official. But unofficially, if we include folks who want to work full-time but can only find part-time work, those who have given up actively looking for work, the rate is actually 13.2%. That's the real unemployment rate in America. So given that the unemployment rate remains high in many parts of the country, my colleague, Senator Jack Reed, and I have introduced a modest proposal to extend the current system of federally funded extended unemployment insurance until the end of 2014. It's vitally important that we do so because it's going to expire in 2 weeks. Almost 5 million American workers and their families will exhaust their state unemployment insurance and lose their last lifeline before the end of next year. We are their last lifeline. They're counting on us. How can we think about turning our backs on them? But instead of joining a call to action, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are actually suggesting that the extension of unemployment insurance will hurt jobless Americans. I was rather shocked when I heard this on a Sunday talk program by our colleague from Kentucky, Senator Paul. Here's what he said. I got the quote. You can get it on YouTube. Here's what he said. When you allow people to be on unemployment insurance for 99 weeks, you're causing them to become part of this perpetual unemployed group in our economy. And while it seems good, it actually does a disservice to the people you're trying to help. A disservice? I don't understand. I don't understand this kind of harshness for people who are out of work, who have paid in to unemployment insurance, and they're seeking now to get their insurance payments. First of all, this is not quite right, 99 weeks. The maximum is 73 weeks, and that's only for those who have been unemployed the longest, and it's only in 2 states. Only 2 states have 73 weeks. Those are the 2 states with the highest unemployment rates. The rest of the states have access to at most 63 weeks. In Iowa, my state, it's only 40 weeks, not 99. Secondly, unemployment insurance is a desperately needed program. Let's be clear, unemployed workers are not living high on the hog on these insurance payments. It averages about $310 per week nationally. Well, I guess that figures out, if you were on it for a year, that's about $15,000 a year. Now, there's some that are less than that. Mississippi, for example, is $193 a week, not $310, $193. The truth is they're barely subsisting, barely hanging on. They're not sitting around watching TV. Why? Because there's only one way you can collect unemployment insurance benefits. That's number one, if you have worked and paid into the system. So you've already earned the right to access the insurance that you paid for. And secondly, you can only collect on the insurance if you are actively looking for a job. Actively looking for a job. So contrary to the statement of our colleague from Kentucky, it is not a disservice to provide this meager benefit to the long-term unemployed, a benefit that they've earned. The only disservice is to float this absurd myth that jobless Americans want to be unemployed. I think it's just offensive to suggest that they're lazy and don't want to work. To me, it's just morally repugnant to conclude that they will somehow be miraculously better able to find a job if we simply let their kids go hungry. Harshness. Harshness. That same harsh kind of thinking has also crept into our national debate about the most fundamental aspect of our social safety net, food assistance. Millions of American families depend upon the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's what everybody thinks of as food stamps. Such a basic kind of thing, right? Having enough to eat in this country? And again, many of these people are in working families. In 2011, 41% of SNAP participants lived in a household where someone was working. But over the last several years, my Republican colleagues have sought again and again and again to slash food assistance for these families. The House passed Farm Bill. House passed Farm Bill, engineered by the Republicans in the House, proposed cutting food stamps by $40 billion over the next 10 years. Now, contrast it to that, what we passed in the Senate. Under the leadership of Senator Stabenow, we passed a farm bill that made some cuts over the 10 years, a little over $4 billion. That was supported on both sides of the aisle, the farm bill was, by most people on both sides. House bill was only supported by the Republicans. $40 billion the Republicans wanted to cut versus $4 billion in the Senate. That would have cut 3.8 million individuals from the SNAP program next year. Other parts of their proposal would cut off food stamps and benefits in the future for some of the poorest adults, people for many of whom SNAP is the only income assistance they have. Or it would result in throwing 210,000 children out of their free school meals program. Raise the level so that low-income kids would be cut out of their free lunch program. Yet another provision that the House Republicans put into their bill would have provided strong financial incentives to states to kick people off of the SNAP program. The House Farm Bill would allow states to cut off SNAP benefits to most adults receiving or applying for SNAP, including parents with children as young as 1 year old, if they are not working or participating in a work or training program for at least 20 hours a week. That was it. No exclusion for mothers with little kids. The House bill meant that mothers with young children still in diapers could be cut off from food stamps, from the SNAP program, even if they don't have affordable child care. Imagine that, forcing a mother to choose between employment and safe child care for her child. Harshness. And again, as I said, this isn't even realistic. We already said there's 3 job seekers for every job. 48 states have a waiting list for our largest job training program, the Workforce Investment Act. 48 states, waiting list. So you're going to tell this young mother with a child, you can't get adequate child care, but you've got to be in a job training program. Well, the lists are so long you can't get in it. Or you got to be working. 3 job seekers for every job. What's she going to do? So never mind reality. Somehow Republicans seem to think that denying food assistance will magically make people find jobs, despite the fact that jobs don't exist. Getting people into the workforce will require a stronger, growing economy with real jobs, with strong job training programs that really will help people get ahead. But promoting draconian cuts to SNAP benefits under this sort of benign-sounding work label does not make the effect any less harsh. What we've seen in recent years with respect to the SNAP program are not concerted and sincere efforts to help people leave the SNAP program because they've gained employment or because our economy is getting stronger. Quite the contrary. Many Republicans just want to eliminate food assistance for families without regard for the true nature of the economy or the effect on those families. In addition to acknowledging the fundamental economic truth that our job market has not adequately recovered, and that for many Americans, programs like unemployment insurance and food stamps are essential to basic survival, we also have an obligation to face another, perhaps even more alarming, economic reality. For those at the bottom who are working and who are playing by the rules, it's just not enough. Hard-working people, working full times, sometimes multiple jobs, aren't getting paid enough to make ends meet. Full-time workers living in poverty, families living in poverty, they go to work every day. This is a fundamental failing of our economy, and it's something I believe we have a moral obligation to do by fixing and raising the minimum wage in America. I've introduced a proposal that I worked on for a long time with Congressman George Miller in the House, the Fair Minimum Wage Act. It would gradually raise the minimum wage from $7.25 an hour, where it is now, to $10.10 an hour. Then it would link the minimum wage to cost of living in the future. So it would be indexed. And we would provide a raise in the minimum wage for tipped workers, which hasn't been done in more than 20 years. So let's look at what's happened to the minimum wage. Since 1968, which by all means was a pretty good economic year, if we had kept the minimum wage at basically the same level, inflation adjusted, since 1968, the minimum wage today would be $10.75 an hour. It's now $7.25 an hour. You wonder why there are more people on food stamps. Look at what's happened. And these are people working, by the way. They're people you meet every day. You meet them every day when you go in to get that coffee, when you go into that lunch counter, that department store. You see these minimum wage workers every day. Probably if you've got daycare for your kids, you probably see them too. Well, again, if we had kept it at this level, that family making a minimum wage would have an additional $7,000 every year to spend on necessities. It's no wonder that working people turn to the safety net. In fact, a recent study found that taxpayers have to pick up the tab for millions of working families getting the minimum wage. We have to pick up the tab to the tune of about $243 billion a year. Why? Well, that's what we pay for food stamps, Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program, Earned Income Tax Credit Program, and temporary assistance to needy families. $240 billion a year. So, taxpayers are picking up the tab. So, if you want to say who benefits from an increase in the minimum wage, not only the people making the minimum wage, taxpayers too. Because a lot of this, not all of it, a lot of it will fall by the wayside because people won't qualify any longer for the safety net programs. Businesses will benefit too. The biggest problem businesses, especially small businesses, have right now is lack of consumer demand, poor sales. You put money back in the pocket of low-income workers, that'll be a boon to small businesses. And it'll be a boon to your businesses on Main Street because that's where they will tend to shop. Many of these low-income workers don't drive out to the suburbs. A lot of them don't go online and buy at Amazon.com, but they'll go to their neighborhood stores, and that's where they spend their money. In a poll earlier this year, 2/3 of small business owners said they support raising the minimum wage because they know it will help increase consumption and reduce pressure on taxpayer-funded public benefit programs. Now, we always hear the claim that if you raise the minimum wage, it'll cost jobs. That's just not true. The most sophisticated empirical economic research conducted over the last 2 decades has shown repeatedly that minimum wage increases do not cause job loss. Not generally, not among teenagers, and not among restaurant workers. In short, history shows us time and again that despite all the cries of doom and gloom, from richly paid lobbyists, well-funded trade associations, there are simply no real negative economic consequences from an increase in the minimum wage. To the contrary, the benefits are enormous. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that our bill would pump an additional $22 billion into the gross domestic product, supporting 85,000 new jobs, giving workers an additional $35 billion to spend over the 3 years of the implementation, and of course, more beyond that. $14 million children in America will have a parent who gets a raise just because of increasing the minimum wage. And again, this makes a real difference in people's lives. As I said, they're not going to the Riviera, they're not going to vacations on the beach. 15 million women get a raise, 13 million men, 4 million African-American workers, 7 million Hispanic workers, 7 million parents. And it's going to make a real difference in their lives. We just kind of figured it up. A boost to 1010 would mean an extra $6,000 a year. Think what that means for someone who right now is maybe making, well, the minimum wage makes you around $14,000 to $15,000 a year. Now you're going to get, after 3 years of implementation, you get $6,000 a year more. 7 months of groceries, 6 months of rent, 1 semester at a public four-year university, $1,600 of gas. That's a real difference. That's a real difference. Now I've heard some say they think the earned income tax credit should be the answer to the problem of low wages. But what this overlooks is that the earned income tax credit only helps families with children. Childless adults who work full-time at the minimum wage actually earn too much to qualify for the earned income tax credit. But the minimum wage is not even enough for a single person to survive on. Moreover, just relying on the earned income tax credit would simply shift more cost to the taxpayers, rather than requiring employers to pay a fair wage. And it would actually incentivize employers to pay even less in wages. Mr. President, the minimum wage raise we're proposing is particularly important for tipped workers, millions, who will receive a raise for the first time in 22 years. Workers who receive tips will get a raise in their base wage. These include not only restaurant servers, but also nail salon workers, pizza delivery drivers, coat checkers, parking attendants, many, many more. Right now, under current federal law, employers are required to pay, get this, only $2.13 an hour to tipped workers. So rather than supplementing wages, tips have been actually, over the last 20 years, replaced wages. But this is insecure for workers. It often leaves them in poverty. There's no predictability to tips. Often workers go home with only tips because tax deductions cancel out their cash wages. This right here, this is an actual copy of a real check made out to a restaurant worker in the District of Columbia. In the District of Columbia. A paycheck. Check date 8/5/2013. $0.00. This is a real person. She got, I left her name off, but she got a check, a paycheck for $0.00. Why? Well, when they took out withholding and her FICA taxes, she didn't make enough to even get paid. Some people say, well, she got tips. Well, maybe. But anyone who gets tips can tell you one day they're up and the next day they're down. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not. How do you budget on that? That's like saying earned income tax credit. I've already pointed out the fallacy of that, but that only comes a year later. I'm talking about how do you live from paycheck to paycheck when your paycheck is zero. You can't plan on your budget. You can't raise a family on it. No one who works for a living should come home with a paycheck that says $0 when they've worked over 40 hours a week. So this bill, my bill, would establish a fair balance between wages and tips by slowly, over 6 years, lifting the base wage for tipped workers from $2.13 an hour to 70% of the minimum wage. That's more in line with how tipped minimum wage worked in the decades past. Now, the National Restaurant Association claims it can't afford to raise these wages. But it says that every time we propose raising the minimum wage. The National Restaurant Association opposes any minimum wage increase at any time. They can afford it. In fact, the last minimum wage increase from 2007 to 2009, which meant raises for workers like bussers, kitchen staff, and others who don't regularly receive tips, didn't hurt the industry. But they said so at the time. Here's what they said. In 2007, when we were here debating an increase in the minimum wage, here's what they said. A minimum wage increase will cost our industry jobs, 2007. Flash forward, 2012. Here's what the restaurant industry said, quote, the restaurant industry not only provided much-needed job growth during the sluggish last decade, it also is poised to post steady growth well into the future. They can't have it both ways. This is the truth. They provided job growth. More power to them. But don't come here and tell us that an increase in the minimum wage and an increase in the minimum wage for tipped workers is going to cost them jobs. That just doesn't hold. Mr. President, I'll close with one more statement from a real worker whose life will be improved if we step up and support people who work in our country. She has a lesson for us. Jackie Perkins works at a restaurant in Denver, Colorado, and she says, quote, you're talking about real people. You sit in your ivory tower in the legislature and talk about economics and numbers and jobs, but what you don't understand is there are real jobs and real workers who have families that they need to support. And raising the minimum wage helps me support myself and my family and to advance and to achieve the American dream. End quote. So, Mr. President, I believe in Jackie's dreams and those of all these hardworking Americans, as I said earlier, who make the country work, who make it operate. As we look ahead to the Christmas season and New Year, I hope that all my colleagues here will take time over the holidays to think about all the blessings they have been given and all that we should be thankful for. I hope we put ourselves in the shoes of these working people who just want to build a better life for themselves and their children. Think about the minimum wage retail worker that you see when you go into that store to shop for that Christmas present. Works hard running that cash register, standing on her feet all day, but she can't even afford to shop in her own store. Think of the unemployed worker who must go to the local food bank because he can't find a job. Food stamps have run out, and they can't afford that nice big turkey and all the dressing and everything else for Christmas dinner. I guess I'll close where I started. We've just got to stop being so harsh and having these harsh attitudes towards people at the lower economic end of our spectrum. They have value too. Their lives have value. Their work has tremendous value. Country couldn't exist, couldn't operate without people like that. So let's find our public policies to being a little bit more considerate, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more understanding of the real tough lives that some people have in our society. Let's have a compassion that's born of an understanding that we are so privileged to live in the richest country in the world. We can afford to make sure people have enough food to eat. We can afford to make sure that people who are unemployed get unemployment insurance benefits next year. We can afford that. We can afford to increase the minimum wage. We can afford these things, and we'll be a better country, socially and economically, if we do so. We have a duty, I believe, to sort of put ourselves in their shoes. We have a duty to make sure that people who do the work like that in our country get a fair chance to aspire to the American dream. So I hope we all have a good holiday season, Christmas, New Year, with our families and our friends. And I hope we take time to pause and reflect also, as I said, on our blessings and our obligations towards people who just may not be as fortunate as we are. So I hope that when we come back, that we will support a strong food assistance program, a deserved and long overdue increase in the minimum wage, and an extension of federal unemployment insurance. And let's have a new year that's filled with less harshness and a little bit more compassion and understanding for our fellow Americans. Mr. President, with that I yield the floor.